Hi everyone, and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today got a bit of a double trouble. I've painted the Bull Centaurs and Anointed Sentinels from the Hellsmiths of Hashut. This new Warhammer kit actually allows you to build both in one kit, so you can build the lower half of the model and stop there, and then you can paint the build the three centaurs and the three sentinels separately and attach one that you would want to use for your next battle, maybe like a little bit of blue tack or sticky tack to keep it on, so you don't have to use any super glue. So you get sort of double your models from one kit. If you could source another three of the lower halves, then you've got yourself a bargain really. So yeah, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint the lower halves and then the top halves of both of the kits that you get. So yeah, built them separately. There's a hole below each of the torsos so that you can get an old bit of sprue and stick it up in there with some super glue so you can hold on to it. So yeah, it's a nice multi-kit from Warhammer. So first off, I primed the model with the Army Painter's Matte Black Air Primer, and the first step, I want to lay down my coldest colour for our heat effects, and that's going to be AK Black Red, which is a nice dark reddish brown. And with the airbrush, I've thinned it down a little bit, so 50-50 really with the thinning down, but it does depend on how much pressure you've got in your compressor and sort of the quality of your airbrush. I generally go for a 50-50 and then work from there. I'm working at about I think it's about 25 psi, but you can sometimes go to 30. It just completely depends on your airbrush really, but 20 to 30 psi is more than enough. And just work around now and just lay down a nice layer of this over your lower half of the body, and of course the sentinels as well, because they're the ones that have got the main glowing effect coming from them. Don't worry necessarily about painting the spear parts there. So next up, using the Mr. Weathering white panel liner, which comes all nicely ready made, so you haven't got to worry about making your own oil-based panel liner. You can just get it straight out of the pot, give it a good shake. The fluorescents that we're going to use work best over pure white, and I found that to get a lovely white, the oil-based ones, when they dry, still maintain that intense whiteness that we're going for. So all I'm doing here is I'm laying down a sort of layer of white to where I want it to be the brightest. So that's within all of the recesses, any deep areas, almost like, imagine lava. You've got your coolest part further away from the big heat source. So you get that dark black for the basalt all the way down to the bright, almost white hot lava core. And that's what we're going for here. So the recesses is where the heat is generating from, getting cooler as it gets further away. So just work yourself around the model, remembering to do the top half as well. I'll show you how to do that, how I did it in this tutorial, and just work around, putting down a layer of this. Don't worry if it looks terrible when you first do this. We're going to be using the airbrush in a minute to help get some transitions from that pure white and black red. Do some nice gradients with just a few short sharp bursts using the natural haloing effect that you get with an airbrush. And once you're done, just to clean your brush out, I use the AK odorless thinners. I have 2 pots of this, one to clean my brushes and one that I used if I need to thin down any oil paints. I then put some Liquitex pure white ink into the airbrush, and with some short sharp bursts I now try and transition from that pure white out, so that we get a nice transition between our pure white and our black red. I aim into the center, or as close to the center of where those white lines, shapes that we've drawn, so that you get that pure white in the middle, radiating, sort of gradienting out to your black red. So very, very easily you start to just get some glowing effects happening now, where you'll see nice bright core darkening itself as it gets to the outer edges. So this is a very high contrast way of showing how the airbrush actually works. So the airbrush works with the most paint is in the center, and then it gradients itself out. So you're seeing that here, where you've got that pure white in the middle moving outwards towards the black red. So short, sharp bursts. As soon as you see that ink start to shine on the model, stop and move to another area, because that means it's wet, and the air and pressure that comes out of the airbrush can spiderweb that paint out and create some nasty looks that you've almost got to go back to scratch on to fix. So usually at this point, when I want to lay down my first yellow-orange, I would use the Green Stuff World yellow, fluorescent yellow-orange that's already comes in the pot. But Green Stuff World now do the fluorescents in inks, and they mix really well. So I've done a 50, it's probably actually not even 50-50, I would say it's probably 70-30 mix in favour of fluorescent yellow to fluorescent orange ink. So you get a nice deep yellow orange fluorescent colour, and into the airbrush, and now I pretty much spray the entire model, really anywhere that's been painted black red I now paint with this colour, just to now start getting, this is our brightest, almost our brightest colour that we're going to have. I don't really go to pure yellow, this is our brightest that we'll have. I then move on to Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red, So this colour now will tone down that yellowy orange, but add a red. The coolness of it actually makes it warmer. It's bizarre how it works. It always blows my mind when I see this happening. So we're toning it down now by adding this fluorescent red, but we're adding almost heat to it, that it's starting to radiate itself out. So this is now aimed away from those recesses. This is aimed now into the sort of areas where you're imagining it to be cooler. So the tops of the muscles. Try and use the airbrush like you're dry brushing, where as you're spraying it, you're only letting a bit of that spray touch the top edges of some of these areas, and then just work it up in layers. Small sprays with the airbrush, short sharp bursts, as you can see I'm doing there. Hardly anything's coming out, and we're just building up those layers until you're happy with the intensity. This is our first darkening down, but by darkening it down we add intensity to our glowing effect. If you've still got some fluorescent red left in the airbrush, don't worry about cleaning it out. Now just add a few drops of Vallejo red ink, and what this will do is the next level of cooling, and it just adds, it almost desaturates the red, but it looks quite bright in the airbrush, but this red ink is quite dark. I paint blood angels with this red ink, and it is quite a dark red. And what it will do now, you don't need too much of this, but this is really focused heavily on the areas that you want to be absolutely the coolest parts. We'll be doing some another dark colour over the top and a little bit of dry brushing, but this is where we start to really tone down the glowing effects. Try and aim away from your central core, your hot points, at the very centre now of your cooling area. So we've gone from our fluorescent yellow orange as our brightest point. Now our coldest point currently is this red ink. And then if you've got any of this red ink left in the airbrush, you can just add a few drops of AK Tenebrous Grey to it, give it a few more drops of water as well, so you still maintain that sort of 50-50 mix. If you've used up all the red ink, don't worry about it. It doesn't really add much to it, it just saves you having to clean it out multiple times. So what we've now done is created this colour, this AK Tenebrous Grey, is the coldest part of our heat effect. This is where that sort of, you get that basalt on top of the lava, where the lava's cooled so much. This is what we're sort of doing here, where we've got that molten lavary iron core of our Sentinels, and now it's gone cold and crusty. And Tenebrous Grey, or any cold black colour, like Ionic, cold black, Warhammer Corvus black, they're really good colours because they're not just pure black. They have subtle tones to them, subtle greys, subtle greens, subtle blues. This has got a subtle purpleness to it, and when it dries, it's got this dusty look as well. So just take care now, only aim this into the very coldest parts now, so that's going to be where it's furthest away from the heat source. You can see that I'm sort of aiming it downwards so that I kind of create transitions where you've got really hot parts at the sort of kneecap, but then above that starts to cool down. So a little bit like where we're spraying the airbrush, but we're sort of dry brushing it. We're only catching those top edges when we pull the trigger. So that's it for the airbrush for now, to creating our glowing effects. We're just going to darken it down a little bit more by using pure tenebrous grey and then a smallish size dry brush. And now I'm going to dry brush. It's quite heavily actually, it's not that light, but I'm dry brushing now over the hands, the knuckles, the raised parts on his skin, just to really darken them down. But again, by darkening it down, we're increasing the intensity of our glowing effect, especially over the face, so it's all the inner part of the face that's really glowing. And it's quite heavy on the hooves and the ankles, because I imagine they'd be quite cold. I imagine the core of this creature that's actually covered up by all the armour and robes is where it's hottest, and then it's just cooling down the further away it gets from its central core. And there we go, a few steps, about half hour, 40 minutes of work in real time, and you've got some quite sweet looking anointed sentinels already. So now we're just moving into the other parts of the model, and the first we're going to do are the robes on the lower torso and the sort of the sash that they wear. For that I wanted sort of a purpley magenta colour, so my base coat for that is AK Violet Red. Once that's dry, I then get some Warhammer Druchii Violet and just do a gentle wash over the where we've just done that violet red. Once the Druchii Violet is dried, probably 10 or 15 minutes, just seeing as you see here, just making sure we get really this Druchii Violet is just darkening down those recesses. For our first highlight, I use AK Magenta, thin down a little drop of water in it, and this is really an edge highlight and picking out any raised areas or flat areas that you want to be a bit brighter, but main idea here is a nice edge highlight. On the top, on the sort of ribbons that there were, these weird necklace parts, they're sort of ribbed and ridged, a little bit like when you paint Space Marines with the tassels. Just paint the top parts of these, leaving the violet red and Druchii Violet wash in the deepest recesses. For a final highlight, it's sort of optional, and it's a highlight that adds a little bit of wear and tear and desaturation to our magenta. I just mixed in some flayed one flesh to the magenta, just a little bit. It's probably a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio in favour of the flayed one flesh. And what we do is we create a sort of bright magenta, but it's very desaturated, and it's a great way when you create a mix of a desaturated sort of flesh tone with your main highlight colour. You create a desaturated, brighter version of it that is really good for adding nice highlights and wear and tear. So you can highlight as much of the sort of areas as you like, but I always find that sometimes a little bit less is more on these, especially where we want the brightest point of our model to really be the heat effects that we've created. Just moving on to the leather, and it's relatively straightforward. I base coat all of the leather with AK Afro Shadow. I then make a mix of Afro Shadow and AK Deep Brown 50-50 mix and do our first layering, covering probably 90% of what we've just painted, leaving only that Afro Shadow in the deepest recesses, anywhere that would be in shadow. The 50-50 mix is our sort of main sort of first layer to just give some colour, and then I use deep brown as our first highlight, so make sure you edge highlight everything, add some little scratches and scrapes, weathering as you see fit. And then I use AK cork as a sort of spot highlight, so just doing little edge highlights here and there where it would be the most damaged, most worn down. When painting leather, it's not necessarily you're highlighting it. With leather, you're sort of creating damage and wear and tear. That's how I see when I paint leather. It's not where the light would be necessarily catching it, it's where the most damage would be. The next step, won't lie, it's quite a long one, is painting the trim. I use AK rusty gold. Any dark gold will work here. You'll notice on a lot of my tutorials, when I've done the airbrush, I then go over everything with a dark base coat again, like with a matte black or a tenebrous grey. But with these, sometimes you can maintain a colour with a heavy layering over the top, but the colours we're using today are quite thick and heavy and dark, so there was no real need to go under them with a black primer. You can do so just to get everything back to a settled layer, but I knew we'll be covering it with doing washes and other darker colours. So yeah, AK rusty gold now, and just very carefully just pick out all of the gold trim. There's a lot of images on the end of this video of what I've painted, and of course I try and keep these as real time as I can, sort of painting a single model. So right now I'm painting all three models at the same time, but I'm only capturing, sort of doing this on one of the models. Don't worry if you get any over the armour, we'll be painting that in a dark colour a bit later. This is just making sure you get a good layer down of your gold. Wanted to add some bronze, so I'm using the brass scorpion from Warhammer, and I do this on the handle of the swords and also the Sentinel's head. So it's really on the Sentinels, I leave the sort of nose and mouth area as the heating effect, and it's the horns and the forehead and there's little side bits of armour that I paint the brass scorpion. used 2 layers of the brass scorpion over these larger areas as I thinned it down quite a bit. I think my paint is getting a little bit old and it's starting to crust up a little bit. For a wash, I use the Warhammer Reikland Flesh Shade, and I just give a nice wash over all of the gold and all of the brass. Once I've done that, I didn't want to bore you to death with how to do that. Once I've done that, I highlight this in 2 stages. The first stage is with a small dry brush, and this is for areas I know I can get to with a dry brush, which is going to be the top half of some of these panels and the Sentinels head. I dry brush with the AK Old Gold, so it's a very bright gold, sort of like a Retributor armour from Warhammer. And then the other areas where I want to do a highlight, I just use a brush and just do a simple bit of edge highlighting with the bright gold. I try not to over highlight these metallics, as it can take a distraction away from our glowing effects. Once I've done that highlight, I then just use some Sycorax bronze and just do dry brushing over the top half of the horns, as that's where I want to be the brightest point. And this is almost silvery when you dry brush this on. So again, it gives a sort of desaturated highlight to our bronze copper effect that we're going for these helmets. The next semi-long process now is the red armour. I make a 50-50 mix of AK Black Red and AK Tenebrous Grey, and that's our darkest colour. And we're going to do a layer of this dark colour and then work up to a semi-bright red. I didn't want a classic Chaos Dwarf bright red, as I wanted to maintain our glowing effects as our brightest points. That was one key goal here. Simple here, that 50-50 mix, just paint all over the armour panels. Just make sure you are careful around your gold trim, careful around your body. But yeah, this is a simple sort of base coating our armour. So the next step is introducing red. So I'm using the Ionic Red, which is like a AK Deep Red or an Evil Sun Skull. It's just a very bright red. So one of the great things with a wet palette is you can start to create your transitions there and then by mixing the paint in, adding a little bit of water, blending the paints together on the wet palette so that you go from your darkest colour to your bright colour. You're getting that transition all the way down. So at any point you can drag your brush through any part of that to get the colour you need to help with the blending on the model. What I'm doing here is really heavy glazing, not with much precision, but with enough precision that we don't get paint all over the place and we have some control. So a heavy glaze is the paint has been watered down, probably 70-30 in favour of water to paint. And with a glaze, you start the brush at your darkest point and pull the paint downwards to your brightest point. So the top part of the armour is dark, the bottom is bright. Or here I'm working sort of from a top corner down to a bottom corner. And here I'm working straight downwards, leaving the dark points in the recesses and the gaps. Where you leave your paintbrush is where the most paint will be left. So when you're glazing, you always push the paint where you want to be brighter or darker. If you're doing the flip of it, when you start doing your blending and you want to go from your light areas to your dark areas, you push the paint towards your dark areas away from your light areas. So here I'm just working really organically. I had an idea in my head that I wanted very darkish red armour with enough red there for you to know that it's red armour, but not that it's really bright like our classic Chaos Dwarfs. Like the ionic red that you see there on the wet palette, that's really bright, but I didn't want to go that bright. If you did want to go that bright, you could do some white at the very bottom and blend into that, so paint over the white so it's really bright. I've shown how to do that in other tutorials, but here I'm just working around adding brighter layers of the glaze in lesser parts of the armour. So you start working it down, glazing smaller and smaller areas so that you get brighter and brighter. Then if you find you get some quite garish and harsh transitions, almost like you can see here, then you can get some of your darker paint and glaze it upwards so that you start getting those transitions between your dark and light. Always with glazing, if it looks quite bad as soon as you put it on, like really bright or really dark, just clean your brush out quickly, wet the brush, and you can use the water on the brush to blend the two out. But if you're happy with the consistency of the paint that you've put on, let it dry. The glazes look brighter when they're first applied because they're wet and they're shiny. When they dry, they regain the matte and the pigment is left, so they do get darker once they've dried. And when you're glazing, it doesn't take very long for that paint to dry. Almost when you're working on 3 models, you've done your first one, second one, third one, your first one's dry. Even working on one model, if it's quite a large one, you can get that same effect. So all I'm really doing here is I'm glazing the paint, gone from that really dark colour to that really bright colour, using the wet palette and its advantages you've got with that by adding more water to it where I need. You've got the colour transitions there. So this is quite a long part of the tutorial. This is how I also paint the Bull Centaurs armour. This is done in exactly the same way, by gaining intensity by adding more ionic red as my glaze to the very bottom, doing little edge highlights, picking out the edges in pure ionic red, little glazes on the brush just to get brighter and brighter where I want it to be, and then reaching a point that I'm happy with and then stopping. As I said, if you wanted to go really bright red, you could add a little bit of white onto the model, not into the mix because that will create pink, and then the ionic red will be brighter on those white areas, or you could just go up a level of red. But sometimes brighter reds become pink, which you don't want. You could use something like Wild Rider red, which has got a hint of orange to it, to gain your intensity. Okay, with that done, I'm just going to go back to the Sentinels and I'm just going to put little white dots in each of their eyes, and let's go over the top of those with some AK fluorescent yellow just to add a little subtle hint that the eyes are really, really bright. They're almost at that stage already with the way I did the earlier steps, but I just went back and intensified that. So for the gems, I wanted them to look like they were really, really shiny. And there's gems on each of their foreheads on the Sentinels. One of them's got 2 earrings, and also the Bull Centaurs have them on their beards or on their earrings. But for the gems, we can use the same principles. Dark is cold, bright is hot, or for our case, bright is shiny. So wine red, so where there's a gem, I paint the wine red of the whole gem and the sort of clasp that it's in, so the entire area. I then use AK blood red, just paint the gem with the blood red. I then use a little bit of white and I do a sort of dot in the top corner where the light is coming in, and then a sort of crescent on the opposite side of that at the bottom where the light is escaping and reflecting off that bottom edge. Once that's dry, I just glaze on a little bit of the fluorescent red, and then if you want to, you can leave it at that point, but if you want to make him look a little bit more fiery, where the white was that you painted, you can just add a little dot of fluorescent orange. The weapons for these guys, I was going to do a clever heat effect on them, but I thought that might distract a little bit from the core. So with these guys, I just painted them in AK gunmetal and then did a couple of washes of Druchii Violet, making sure that the Druchii Violet was glazed on and the paint pushed downwards towards the bottom part of the weapon, so that it's darker purple at the bottom and a sort of just a standard wash. And as you can see there, we've got a really cool looking Anointed Sentinel. Nice transitional colours. The red armour isn't too red and actually blends in a bit with the body, and a good looking weapon. For the Bull Centaurs, as you can see, it's all painted in the same way using exactly the same colours. So the red armour, the magenta of the sash, the weapons have been done gold. The black clothes that he's wearing, I've base coated an AK Tenebrous Grey. Then I'm going over the whole area again with AK Dark Sea Blue. Then I do a very simple highlight afterwards of doing about a 50-50 mix of AK Dark Sea Blue and AK Spectrum Blue, so that we create a sort of lightish bluish green colour, and I just pick out the raised areas with those. I also do that over the fingers. of their gloves as well, just picking out the raised points with like the knuckles and the sort of tips of the gloves that they're wearing. But the main thing I wanted to show you on here, and I get asked to be shown this a lot, is the sort of glowing effects that you can get on maces and thunderhammers. So in that pot there, it's an old Warhammer contrast medium pot. It's 1 part water, 1 part white ink, and 1 part medium. And I've just made a big vat of it in that pot, but you can make it on the fly in your little paint palettes, or you can make a big load of it in one go to save you having to keep mixing it. In that pot I've added a little ball bearing in there just so that you can shake it up and mix that pigment, because the pigment in the white ink tends to settle at the bottom and it needs a good shake. But yes, that's 1 part water, 1 part contrast medium, 1 part white ink, and what you create is a white ink contrast paint. So it flows lovely into recess areas or round shapes, leaving an intenseness to the area, a little bit like our white panel liner does. So you could use your panel liner, but I just find sometimes this contrast medium works a little bit better than the white ink, but either or. And all I'm doing here is I imagine that the hottest point of these weapons is in the centre where the two join, and so I've just painted lines of it down each part of where those two bits of the mace attach. I then use the white ink in the airbrush, and like we've done before, I aim the needle in the direct centre of each of those joins, so that's where the heat is coming from, and just give it a couple of sprays so that we start getting a natural radiating effect of the core of those maces being really hot and the edges being really, really dark. So instead of making a mix of yellow and orange, we're going to start from really, really bright. So I use the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Yellow, which is bright enough that it's maxing out the camera. And just spray the whole of the mace, making sure you give a nice couple of layers to this. Very, very carefully with the fluorescence through the airbrush. They are inks, so they're very thin, so they do come out quite quick. So short, sharp bursts, many layers, not one big layer, it won't work, just many layers of it to keep working yourself around. Don't worry if it looks green. Fluorescent yellow looked green. I don't understand the physics of it, and I have have a degree in physics, and I don't get it, but not colour. So yeah, just work yourself around. Don't worry if it goes green. We take away the green with the orange a bit later. Yeah, just work yourself around, taking care not to get any over your model, sort of always spraying it away from the miniature and just into those central points, but making sure you cover it all. So next up is Green Stuff World Fluorescent Orange ink. So now we need to be careful. Even though we're covering pretty much all of this with fluorescent orange, I'm making sure that I only do sort of one spray in the center. So imagine I give the whole thing a subtle spray of the orange, and then I focus on the outer areas, leaving that central point where we want our most intense yellowness to be, with just one subtle layer of orange over the top of it. Almost like I'm spraying the surrounding areas and letting just the overspray hit those central points. Now this does take a little bit of practice. It's not exactly advanced airbrushing, but it's a bit more of a skilled approach than just blindly spraying over everything. You sort of need to make sure you're aiming your airbrush in those areas, knowing where the overspray is going. So it takes a little bit of practice, but if you get it wrong, you can just start again. Just prime it again in your dark colour, hit it back with your white and just start from scratch. And sometimes even if it does go a bit too orange, you could, once you're finished, add a little bit of white paint to those areas and a little bit of pure white, yellow fluorescent, just to get your intenseness back. So doing little mistakes isn't the end of the world, and sometimes mismatches between the two helps. It makes each weapon look individual and not just a conveyor belt glowing effect, which could then look a bit fake. We're toning down by adding the fluorescent orange, but what we're doing is we're adding heat by adding fluorescent orange. And there, by turning the light off, you can see it a lot better how these heat effects are working. When I've got my lamps on, the brightness from the lamp bleaches out the glowing effects. So what you'll see is more like when the lights are off. So again, like the heat effects on the main bodies, we're toning down by adding fluorescent red, but it tones it down, but really starts to add some heat to this effect. So I'm spraying downwards here, catching those top edges, and a little bit like we were saying now, we're just aiming on the outer edges of the mace, letting almost the center point of the needle is touching outside of the model. So I'm actually aiming the nozzle more onto my workboard than I am onto the mace itself, so that the red only catches the edges of the mace where you want it to be most cool. Short, sharp bursts of this. Less is more, but it's all personal preference of how much you want to add to this. But certainly don't skip this step, because it does add to the intensity of the glowing effects that we're going for. Then that's with the airbrush all done. Then get some tenebrous grey, and then I'm just going to dry brush now, and I'm sort of heavy dry brushing. And what I do is I dry brush, I've imagined this is in thirds, so you've got a bottom third, a middle third and a top third. I dry brush upwards on the top third, downwards on the bottom third, leaving that central core untouched almost, so that we get a heavier build up on the bottom and a heavier build up on the top, with the middle left almost untouched. And again, this tenebrous grey is really cooling it down by adding that cold molten iron look. and it's really effective and really works. Less is more, but sometimes more can be more. You can have as much as this as you want, but just remember you have to have those transitions. So probably 15-20 minutes and you've got some really cool glowing maces on your Bull Centaurs. You could use the same effect on the Sentinels, where the bottom part is the bright yellow, and then you go up to orange, and then the red, and then I would even put some red ink, and then tenebrous grey, almost like you painted the skin. You would paint the spears, swords that they've got. So there's everything all together, the lower halves, and the 6 torsos, 3 Sentinels, 3 Bull Centaurs. That's using a little bit of sticky tack just to keep them on top there. So there's the Bull Centaurs. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you've appreciated that I've shown you how to do both of the models, depending on which ones you want to do. Obviously, if you want to just do all Bull Centaurs, then you don't have to worry about the Sentinels. You can just put glue them on top. But if you've got the time and the patience, certainly doing all of them helps with the meta, because you know that Warhammer GW love to change the meta occasionally. So at one point, Sentinels might become more powerful than Centaurs, or vice versa. Yeah, so hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. Like, comment, subscribe, all those kinds of things. I'm a full-time commission painter and content creator. Please feel free to reach out. If you've got any projects that you need help with, reach out and I can get them painted up for you. There's no harm in asking. I'm UK based, quick turnaround, quality service with this grim glow effects that I love to do. So yeah, like, comment, subscribe, and happy painting, my fellow painters.